So, me caveman, let's go. Number 10. The Talheim Death Pit. In 1983, a man named Albert Knoll was digging a sewer trench beside his house in the German village of Talheim, just outside Heilbronn. His shovel struck bone. By the time the state archaeologist Joachim Wahl arrived, the trench had already opened a small oval pit, about 1.5 meters wide and 3 meters long, no bigger than a household pantry. Inside it were 34 bodies, stacked face down, dumped head first, no funerary care of any kind. The radiocarbon date placed them at roughly 5000 BC, inside the earliest farming culture of Central Europe, the linear band ceramic. The demographic breakdown was 16 children, 9 adult men, 7 adult women, and 2 whose sex could not be determined. 18 of the skulls showed lethal blunt force trauma. The shape of the wounds was distinctive. They matched the cross-section of the polished basalt shoelast adze, the ground stone woodworking tool the victim's own culture used to build their houses. 2 of the dead had also been shot with arrows. 1 had been finished with a sharp axe cut to the jaw. The wounds clustered on the left side and the back of the skull, exactly where a fleeing or kneeling victim would be struck by a right-handed attacker. In 2008, Douglas Price, Joachim Wahl, and Alex Bentley published a strontium isotope study of the bones. They identified 3 distinct dietary subgroups inside the pit: a local farming community, a non-local outsider group, and a handful of children of mixed origin. Equally striking was who was missing. The pit contained women, but almost no women of reproductive age. Whoever had killed the village had taken the desirable women with them before disposing of the rest. 3 competing theories explain what happened. The conventional reading is a frontier raid between rival LBK villages competing for fertile loess soils. A second reading is a hunter-gatherer counterstrike against the farming expansion that had pushed into Central Europe. A third reading, advanced by Christian Meyer after his 2015 reanalysis of the nearby Schöneck-Kilienstetten site, is an internal LBK feud escalating to total annihilation, with systematic torture wounds and shattered shin bones recorded across multiple sites in the same window. What is no longer in dispute is that Europe's first farmers were already capable of erasing an entire community in a single morning, more than 7,000 years ago. Number 9. The Nataruk Massacre. 6,000 kilometers south of Talheim, and 5,000 years earlier in time, an archaeological team from Cambridge University was working a stretch of dried lagoon shore on the western edge of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. Between 2009 and 2012, Marta Mirazon Lars in Africa Project excavated 27 skeletons from a single Mesolithic horizon. 21 were adults, 6 were juveniles. 5 of those juveniles were under the age of 6. The radiocarbon dates fell between 10,500 and 9,500, calibrated years before present. At that time, Lake Turkana stood roughly 30 meters higher than today, and Nataruk sat on a productive marshy lagoon at the lake's edge. 12 of the 27 skeletons showed clear perimortem trauma. 10 had massive cranial fractures. 1 had a small stone projectile point still lodged in the skull. Another had a point embedded in the thoracic vertebrae. 2 of the points were obsidian, sourced from volcanic outcrops hundreds of kilometers south near Lake Naivasha, meaning the attackers had come from somewhere else. Several skeletons had defensive perifractures on the hands and forearms, the kind a person gets when they raise their hands to deflect a club. The most arresting individual, catalogued as KNM-WT71255, was an adult woman in late-stage pregnancy at the moment of death. The bones of a 6 to 9 month fetus lay inside her pelvis. Her hands and feet appeared to have been bound. A second skeleton, an adult male, was found with his hands crossed behind his back, also consistent with binding before death. The findings, published in Nature in January 2016, attracted immediate and vigorous critique. Christopher Stoyanovsky of Arizona State University and Mark Kissel of Appalachian State argued that some of the so-called embedded points were post-depositional artifacts, and that not all of the bound hand interpretations were secure. Lahr published a defense later the same year, supported by micro-CT scans of the insertion angles. 3 competing theories survived that exchange. The first reads Nataruk as the defense of a rich resource patch attacked by outsiders. The second reads it as an inter-band raid for women and captives. The third reads it as a chronic feud that culminated in one decisive event. Even at the most conservative count, with only 6 clear cases of violent death, Nataruk remains the earliest forensically defensible case of mass intergroup violence anywhere in the world. Farming had not yet been invented. Villages did not yet exist. Warfare, it turns out, is older than agriculture. Number 8. The Battle of Mingtiao. Around the year 1600 BC, on a battlefield whose exact location has been argued about for 2,000 years, the king of a small eastern state called Shang met the last king of China's first dynasty in open combat. Shang Tong, the founder, fielded 6,000 picked troops and 70 chariots. King Jai of Xia, the despot, fielded the army of a kingdom in decline. Tang won. Ji fled south to a place called Nanchao and died in exile. The Xia royal line was extinguished. The earliest reference to the battle is in the Book of Documents, in particular a passage called the Tang Shi, the speech of Tang. In it, the new king explains to his soldiers that heaven has withdrawn its mandate from the Xia because of the misrule of King Ji, and that the army's task is simply to carry out the inevitable. That single speech contains the first articulation in human political thought of the doctrine of conditional legitimacy. The mandate of heaven, Chenming in classical Chinese, would justify every dynastic transition in East Asia for the next 3,000 years. The conventional date of the battle, around 1600 BC, comes from the Xia Shangzhou Chronology Project, led by Li Xueqin between 1996 and 2000. The figure of 70 chariots is the most disputed element. Chariots do not appear in the East Asian archaeological record until around 1300 BC at the late Shang capital of Anyang, 3 centuries after the battle. Either the chariot count was added by later editors, or chariot technology arrived earlier than current excavation supports. The early 2 archaeological culture, dating from roughly 1900 to 1500 BC, is identified by most Chinese archaeologists with the late Xia. Palace foundations, bronze casting workshops, and jade ritual goods at early 2 demonstrate the existence of a real Bronze Age polity in the Yellow River Basin at the right time, even if no one knows for sure what its inhabitants called themselves. 3 competing theories on Mingtiao circulate. The first treats the battle as a literal historical engagement preserved through generations of oral tradition. The second reads it as a folk memory of a real political transition compressed into a single legendary event. The third reads it as a purely mythological founding charter built backwards to justify the Shang dynasty. What is no longer in dispute is the consequence. Every Chinese revolution, down to 1949, has been framed by its propagandists using the template that Shang Tang wrote in his pre-battle speech. Number 7. The Battle of Hamoukar. 1,000 kilometers west of Mingtiao, and almost 2,000 years earlier, an independently founded city rose on the Kabur plain of northeastern Syria. Tel Hamoukar began as a small settlement around 4,500 BC and had grown to roughly 13 hectares of dense urban living by 3,700 BC. Excavation under Clements Reichel and Maguire Gibson of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute began in 1999. By the 2005 and 2006 seasons, the team had reached a destruction layer dated to around 3,500 BC. What they found rewrote the history of warfare. Along the outer mud brick walls, the excavators recovered roughly 1,200 clay sling bullets and a further 120 larger clay balls. The bullets were oval, lemon-shaped, 4 to 5 centimeters long. Many were unbaked, suggesting they had been mass-produced in the days or weeks immediately before the assault. The walls themselves had collapsed in directions consistent with battering and fire. Defenders lay trapped beneath fallen buildings. Grain bins were scorched. Pottery had been smashed in place. Above the destruction layer, the local northern ceramic tradition was replaced almost overnight by beveled rim bowls, the standard ration bowl of the southern Mesopotamian Uruk culture. Reichel's 2006 interpretation, published in Antiquity, was that the expanding southern Uruk civilization had forcibly absorbed the northern city in order to secure access to timber, copper, and stone flowing out of the highlands. The earlier consensus, developed by Guillermo Algazi in the 1980s, had treated the Uruk expansion as peaceful trade colonization. Hamoukar's slingstone layer left that model in ruins. A 2017 experimental study by Yosef Salem at Tel Aviv University fired reconstructed late Uruk clay bullets and measured their muzzle energy. The figures came out comparable to a low-caliber handgun. A clay shot at 30 meters could crack a skull or pierce a wicker shield. Combined with the documented sealing and ration bowl bureaucracy on both sides, what Hamoukar shows is centrally directed, logistically prepared, mass-produced warfare more than 5,000 years ago. 3 competing theories explain the assault. The first reads it as a single Uruk military expedition. The second reads it as a sustained colonial conquest of the north. The third reads it as an internal northern revolt that the Uruk culture exploited. All 3 agree on the conclusion. Warfare had become a tool of empire and a permanent feature of urban life the moment cities became big enough to need walls. Number 6. The Tollense Valley Battle. In 1996, an amateur archaeologist named Hans Dietrich Kruger was walking the bank of a slow marshy stretch of the Tollense River in Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, in northeastern Germany. He spotted a human upper arm bone with a flint arrowhead still embedded in it. The find sat in storage for 12 years. In 2008, Detlef Janssen of the State Archaeology Office and Thomas Terberger of Greifswald University began a systematic excavation. Radiocarbon and dendrochronology bracketed the activity to roughly 1300 to 1250 BC in the late Nordic Bronze Age. What they recovered is staggering. Roughly 14,000 individual bones and bone fragments distributed across a 3-kilometer stretch of riverbed and bank, preserved in waterlogged peat in extraordinary condition. The minimum number of individuals identified to date is around 140. The excavated area is estimated to represent perhaps 10% of the original battlefield. The implication is a total combatant count of as many as 4,000 in a single Bronze Age engagement, in a region that the textbook framing had treated as a peaceful backwater. The dead are overwhelmingly young men, aged 20 to 40, with high muscle attachment ratings on their long bones. These were trained warriors, not levied peasants. Their wounds include flint and bronze arrowheads embedded in skulls and spines, crushing fractures from heavy yew and ash wood clubs, and sword cuts to long bones. Several intact wooden clubs survived in the bog. The personal gear recovered includes bronze pins, gold spiral rings, tin clothing decorations, and trade goods of Mediterranean amber. Strontium and oxygen isotope studies by Joachim Berger and colleagues, published in 2017 and 2019, identified 3 distinct dietary signatures: locals from the Tollense lowlands, Southern Central Europeans from somewhere like Bohemia or Bavaria, a third group with more easterly origins. A wooden causeway across the marshy river, dendrochronologically dated to around 1700 BC, ran straight through the densest bone scatter. Whatever the battle was about, it was about control of that crossing. 3 competing theories survive. The first reads Tollense as a clash between rival Nordic Bronze Age polities. The second reads it as a long-distance raid by a southern coalition exploiting the trade route. The third reads it as a pre-Roman migration period precursor to the great folk movements of later prehistory? Any of those answers means the same thing. Northern Europe in 1250 BC had standing trained armies, professional warriors with personal kits, and battles measured in the thousands, 700 years before the textbook Iron Age framing allows. Number 5. The Battle of Megiddo. In the 23rd regnal year of the pharaoh Thutmose III, conventionally 1457 BC, an Egyptian army marched out of Chiaru on the Sinai frontier and reached the city of Yehem 10 days later. Their objective was the rebel coalition of 330 Levantine city-states under the king of Kadesh on the Orontes, who had thrown off Egyptian overlordship in the brief political chaos after the death of Hatshepsut. At Yehem, the Council of War debated 3 routes to Megiddo: the northern road via Zefti, the southern road via Tanakh, the narrow central Aruna Pass. Against the unanimous advice of his generals, Thutmose chose the Aruna Pass. The Karnak inscription preserves his reasoning, recorded by the royal scribe Chaneni from a daily campaign journal. The pass was so narrow that, in the words of the text, horse must follow horse, and man behind man. The pharaoh personally led the vanguard in an electrum-plated chariot under a leopard skin standard. By the time the rebel coalition realized what had happened, the Egyptian army had emerged into the open Jezreel Valley behind the southern wing of their divided force. The battle proper lasted a single day, on the 21st day of the first month of summer. The rebel line broke. Survivors fled to the safety of Megiddo's walls, climbed up on textiles let down by defenders, and barricaded themselves inside. Egyptian troops paused to loot the abandoned camp, a discipline failure that Thutmose's own annals criticize, and lost the chance to take the city by direct pursuit. A 7-month siege followed. When Megiddo finally fell, the booty list ran to 340 prisoners, 83 hands cut from the slain, 2,041 horses, 924 chariots, 200 suits of armor, and 502 bows. That itemized inventory is the world's first known military accounting document. The Karnak inscription itself runs to roughly 220 lines. It is the longest single Egyptian historical text from the New Kingdom and the earliest battle in history for which named generals, troop dispositions, and a secure chronological date all survive. Strategically, Egypt's Levantine Empire was secured for the next 2 centuries. Linguistically, the name of the town survives in the modern word Armageddon, from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, the hill of Megiddo, invoked in Revelation as the site of the eschatological final battle. 3 competing theories interpret Thutmose's Aruna choice: a brilliant tactician seeing what his generals missed, a religious gambler trusting divine guidance, a general already in possession of intelligence the annals do not record. West Point and Sandhurst still teach the maneuver today as the earliest documented case of operational maneuver warfare in human history. Number 4. The Jebel Sahaba Cemetery. In 1964, Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University had a single field season to excavate a low sandstone ridge on the east bank of the Nile, a few kilometers north of Wadi Halfa in northern Sudan. The Aswan High Dam was under construction. Within months, the entire site would be flooded by the rising waters of Lake Nasser. Wendorf and his team lifted 61 skeletons in rows of individual and double graves. They cataloged the site as Site 117. Today, it is the cemetery of Jebel Sahaba. The redating in 2021 placed the cemetery at roughly 13,400 calibrated years before present in the terminal Pleistocene Caudan culture. Wendorf's 1968 publication noted that 24 of the 61 individuals had stone projectile points embedded in or lodged within the body cavity in positions consistent with having killed them. The points were chert with the characteristic Caudan flake retouch. All demographic categories were present: men, women, children, infants. In 2014, Isabelle Crèvecoeur and colleagues at Bordeaux reanalyzed the bones with micro-CT scanning. They identified 106 separate trauma events distributed across 41 individuals, far more than Vendorf's count. Multiple bodies showed healed older wounds and a final fatal point. These were people who had survived earlier attacks before the one that killed them. In 2021, Crevecoeur published a follow-up in Scientific Reports, arguing that the cemetery represents multiple violent episodes over months to years, not a single mass killing. Jebel Sahaba is the archaeological signature of chronic endemic warfare. The geomorphological context, reconstructed by Bell Williams in 2018, is essential. The late Pleistocene Nile in northern Sudan was narrower than today, surrounded by hyper-arid terrain as the Sahara dried out, and acted as a contested refuge for populations retreating from a collapsing savanna. Jebel Sahaba is also the earliest known cemetery anywhere in the world. The act of organized, repeated burial in a defined place is itself older than every later marker of civilization. Three competing theories explain the violence. Defended territory raiding between Nile bands. Climate-displaced refugee competition for the narrowing river. A single ethnic conflict between Qaddan and an outside group. All three are consistent with the data. None of them changes the radical implication of the cemetery's date. Organized killing reaches back at least 13,000 years in the human record. It predates farming, cities, writing, and every empire that follows it on this list. It is older than every later development we credit with making us civilized. Number 3. The Hittite sack of Babylon. In the 15th century BC, the Old Babylonian dynasty, founded by Sumu Abum and brought to its height by Hammurabi, was shrinking. Its empire had contracted to the city of Babylon and its immediate hinterland. The seventh and last king of the dynasty, Samsu-Ditana, sat on the throne. 900 kilometers to the northwest, in the central Anatolian highlands, the Hittite king, Mursili I, ruler of the old Hittite kingdom centered on the city of Hattusa, decided to march south. The expedition followed precedent. Mursili's father or uncle Hattusili I had already campaigned in northern Syria around 1620 BC, sacking Aleppo, the capital of the kingdom of Yamhad. Mursili's army, a few thousand Anatolian infantry equipped with bronze weapons and the early light two-horse chariot, defeated Mari on the route and then descended the Euphrates to Babylon itself. The chronicle entry, preserved in the later Hittite Edict of Telepinu, and corroborated by Babylonian king lists and Mesopotamian astronomical records, records the result in a single line. Mursili broke through Babylon's defenses and sacked the city. The most striking act was religious. From the Esagila, Babylon's great temple complex, the Hittites looted the cult statues of the gods Marduk and Sarpanetum and dragged them back to Hattusa as trophies. Samsu-Ditana was killed. Hammurabi's dynasty ended. The conventional middle chronology dates the event to 1595 BC, but the precise year is itself the most debated date in Bronze Age chronology. The high, middle, low, and ultra-low chronologies hinge on different astronomical readings of the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, tablet 63 of Enuma Anu Enlil, with the rival readings producing dates as far apart as 1651 BC and 1499 BC. What followed was almost more dramatic than the sack itself. Mursili did not occupy Babylon. The Hittites withdrew with their loot. The vacuum was filled almost immediately by the Kassites, a previously little-known people from the Zagros Mountains, who established a dynasty that would rule Babylonia for the next 400 years. The statue of Marduk was eventually returned a century or more later by the Kassite king Agum II in a celebrated act of religious restoration. Mursili himself was murdered on his return to Hattusa by his brother-in-law Hantili. The loot did not consolidate Hittite power. Three competing theories explain Mursili's motive: strategic resource control of the Euphrates trade, dynastic propaganda back home, pure religious trophy raiding. The wider significance is the precedent. A peripheral highland power had projected force into the heartland of urban civilization and demonstrated that the great floodplain empires were vulnerable to long-range raids by mobile armies. Every later conquest of Mesopotamia, by the Medes, the Persians, the Mongols, would follow Mursili's playbook. Number 2. The Gutian sack of Akkad. Half a millennium before Mursili broke through Babylon's walls, the first true empire in human history had already fallen, more completely, and with consequences still visible today. Sargon of Akkad founded that empire around 2334 BC. Multiple ethnic groups, multiple cities, single bureaucracy, single capital, the original imperial model. His grandson Naram Sin took the empire to its peak around 2254 BC, styling himself king of the four quarters and becoming the first Mesopotamian king to be deified during his lifetime. His great-grandson Shar-Kali Shari inherited a fragmenting state, fighting Elamites in the east, Amorites in the west, and Gutians in the Zagros. The Gutians were a people of the central Zagros Mountains, in what is today western Iran and Iraqi Kurdistan. Akkadian propaganda described them as illiterate, unwashed, and without intelligence. The Sumerian poem The Curse of Agada, composed perhaps a century after the fall, blamed the destruction on the god Enlil's anger over Naram Sin's damage to the Ikor temple at Nippur. Modern scholarship treats that as theological backfill. The Sumerian king list records 21 Gutian kings ruling for between 91 and 124 years, with many of those names appearing nowhere else in the record. In 2019, Ashish Sinha and colleagues published a stalagmite climate study from Golizard Cave in Iran in Nature. They identified a 290-year megadrought beginning precisely around the fall of Akkad, the so-called 4.2K event. The same event coincides with the collapse of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, the decline of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus, and the abandonment of the Liangzhu culture in China. The modern consensus on Akkad's fall now models climate stress amplifying barbarian pressure. Drought hollowed out the imperial tax base. The Gutians delivered the killing blow. The most extraordinary single fact about Akkad is that no one has ever found it. The capital of the world's first empire has never been excavated. Candidate locations include Tel Muhammad, north of Babylon, the area around modern Baghdad, the Tigris-Diyala confluence, and an unexcavated mound called Tel Sipar Aruru. After more than a century of Mesopotamian archaeology, the city that taught the world how to build empires is geographically lost. Three competing theories model the collapse: pure climate determinism, pure Gutian military pressure, a systems collapse of Akkadian overextension that the Gutians merely accelerated. Around 2120 BC, Utuhegel of Uruk defeated the last Gutian king Tirigan and liberated Sumer. His nephew Ur-Nammu founded the third dynasty of Ur, the Sumerian Renaissance, and the earliest preserved law code. The Akkadian language survived its empire and remained the diplomatic lingua franca of the Near East for the next 1,500 years. The capital itself stayed buried. Number 1. The Sea Peoples and the Battle of the Delta. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean came apart. Inside 2 generations, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the Canaanite city-states, the great Syrian port of Ugarit, and the Cypriot Bronze Age centers all ceased to exist. The collapse was not a slow decline. It was a cascade of fires, sieges, and migrations that erased an interconnected world in a single human lifetime. At the heart of the wreckage, in the Egyptian records, are the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples are a confederation of seaborne raider groups named in Egyptian sources: the Shurden, the Shekelesh, the Luka, the Peliset, the Jeker, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Modern scholarship tentatively links the Peliset with the later Philistines, the Danaan with the Greek Danaui, the Shurden with Sardinia, and the Shekelesh with Sicily. They appear in records of the reigns of Ramesses II at Kadesh in 1274 BC, where the Shurdans serve as Egyptian mercenaries, and in Merneptah's Great Karnak inscription in 1207 BC. The decisive engagement is the Battle of the Delta in year 8 of Ramesses III, approximately 1175 BC, at the mouth of the Nile. That battle is recorded on the second pylon and the first courtyard reliefs of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in western Thebes. The reliefs show Egyptian river galleys ambushing Sea People's ships among the papyrus marshes, archers firing volleys from shoreside ramparts, and Sea People's warriors in distinctive horned helmets and feathered headdresses, armed with the long, double-edged Nawe, the second cut-and-thrust sword. Ramesses III boasted of having made the enemy like turned-over baskets. By the time the battle was fought, the Hittite Empire was already gone. Its last king, Suppiluliuma II, vanishes from the record around 1190 BC. Hattusa was burned and abandoned. Ugarit was destroyed by fire and never rebuilt. The last clay tablets from its burning archive include letter RS 18.147 from King Amurapi to the King of Alashia on Cyprus, which reads, "My father, the enemy ships have come. They have set fire to my cities and done abominable things in my country." Mycenaean Greece was destroyed in a cascade of palace burnings between 1200 and 1150 BC. The linear B script vanished for 400 years. The classical Greeks of the 8th century BC no longer knew that their own ancestors had been literate. 3 competing theories model the collapse. Climate-driven drought as the primary trigger. Mass migrations and the Sea Peoples as the primary trigger. A systems collapse of interlinked palace economies with no single cause. The 2019 Ancient DNA study of Philistine remains at Ashkelon by Michael Feldman, and colleagues found Southern European ancestry components in the early Iron Age population, supporting the migration component for at least one of the named groups. Eric Klein's 2014 book, 1177 BC. The year civilization collapsed remains the standard modern synthesis. Egypt survived the collapse, but never recovered its empire. Within 80 years of Ramesses III's death, the new kingdom had fragmented. Every later Mediterranean civilization, the Phoenician, the Greek, the Israelite, and ultimately the Roman, emerged from the ashes of what the Sea Peoples ended. Across the 10 battles on this list, one pattern is impossible to miss. 2 of the earliest sites, Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba, are older than the invention of farming. Talheim is older than the invention of cities. Hamoukar is older than the invention of writing. The conventional model of the 20th century, advanced most influentially by Entry, advanced most influentially by Lawrence Keeley in his 1996 book War Before Civilization, treated organized warfare as a function of surplus. The reasoning was straightforward. Stored grain is something worth fighting for. Permanent fields are something worth defending. Without those, no war. Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba shattered that model. People at Nataruk had no grain. People at Jebel Sahaba had no fields. They had a productive lagoon shore and a narrowing river refuge as the Sahara dried. That was enough. Marta Mirazon-Lar's reframing of the evidence, published in Nature in 2016, argued that warfare emerges whenever nomadic bands begin to defend rich, predictable resource patches as territory. Anything reliably worth fighting over will be fought over. The forensic revolution since 2010 has been the second major correction. Micro-CT scanning, strontium isotope analysis, ancient DNA, and high-resolution radiocarbon redating have all matured at the same time. Every site on this list has been reanalyzed with at least one of these techniques in the past 15 years, and every original interpretation has been revised. Some have been intensified. Schoeneck-Kilienstetten now shows systematic leg breaking as a torture technique. Some have been softened. Some of Nataruk's individual cases are no longer treated as forensically secure. The total picture has only grown more violent, not less. The careful distinction inside the field is between intergroup violence, feud, and warfare. Intergroup violence simply means killing between members of different groups. Feud means cyclical reprisal between defined parties. Warfare means organized, sustained, group-on-group violence with planning, recruitment, and intent. Nataruk is intergroup violence at minimum, probably warfare. Jebel Sahaba is documented warfare across multiple events. Talheim is documented warfare with selective sparing of high-value captives. Once cities form, the same behavior scales. It does not appear from nowhere. The pattern was already millennia old. Every battle on this list except Megiddo correlates with a known climate event. The 8.2 Ka event, around 6,200 BC, affected East African lake levels and is the climate context for the lead up to Nataruk. A multi-decade drought signal in the Greenland ice core around 5,100 BC sits inside the window for the LBK collapse of Talheim. The 4.2 Ka event, around 2200 BC, is now identified in paleoclimate records from Egypt, the Indus, China, and Mesopotamia, and lines up precisely with the fall of Akkad. The 3.2 Ka event, around 1200 BC, overlaps the Late Bronze Age collapse. The mechanism is consistent across all four events. Reduced rainfall reduces carrying capacity. Reduced carrying capacity intensifies competition between groups. Intensified competition either hollows out central authority by eroding the tax base, or pressures peripheral groups to migrate, or both at once. The drought does not pull the trigger. It loads the rifle. The risk in this reading is climate determinism, the idea that climate alone explains historical change. That risk is real and worth flagging. The 8.2 K event did not cause Nataruk by itself, any more than the 4.2 K event built the Gutian army. What climate does is shift the probabilities. It makes more pressure points active simultaneously. It compresses the timescale on which existing tensions resolve. The Late Bronze Age system was already fragile in the late 13th century BC. A multi-decade drought made it impossible to hold together. The forward implication is uncomfortable. The modern world is more interconnected than the Late Bronze Age, not less. Its agricultural systems are more brittle in many regions, not less. Climate stress in the 21st century is therefore more likely to produce cascading geopolitical effects than smooth adaptive change. None of the battles on this list is a prediction. All 10 of them are historical analogs, which is the only thing the deep past can ever be. The phrase mass production usually evokes 19th century factories and stamped metal parts. The archaeological record argues something more uncomfortable. The mass production of standardized weapons is at least 7,000 years old. The 1,200 clay sling bullets at Hamoukar are oval, lemon-shaped, and almost identical to each other. Many were unbaked at the time of the assault, implying a production line operating in the days before the attack. Yosef Salem's 2017 ballistic experiments quantified the result. A Hamoukar clay bullet at 30 meters has the muzzle energy of a low-caliber handgun. Talheim's adzes were sourced from amphibolite quarries in the Jistebsko outcrop in northern Bohemia, hundreds of kilometers from the village. They moved along the same linear band ceramic trade networks that distributed pottery and seed grain. Those long-distance trade networks turn out to have weaponized themselves. The obsidian points at Nataruk and the chert points at Jebel Sahaba show similar long-distance procurement of raw material. Tollense recovered standardized personal kits, including identical bronze rings, knives, and awls, suggesting standardized issue or pay, and in 2024, the team published a 40-item kit deposit from a single warrior. What this implies is unromantic. Logistical command, standardized production, and centralized supply are not industrial-era inventions. They are not even Bronze Age inventions. They are at minimum Neolithic, and arguably earlier. The instinct to treat ancient warfare as a haphazard collection of duels and ambushes is a modern back projection that the evidence does not support. People who fought in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age fought with standardized, mass-produced, pre-positioned weapons, just like people who fight today. Only the materials changed. Akkad and the late Bronze Age world together demonstrate three features of civilizational collapse that the modern instinct underweights. The first is speed. Akkad fell across roughly one human lifetime. The late Bronze Age system disintegrated across roughly 2 generations. The popular intuition that civilizations fade gradually over centuries is mostly wrong. The fall, when it comes, is fast. The second is multi-causality. Neither collapse has a single cause. Akkad was killed by drought and barbarian pressure and imperial overextension working together. The late Bronze Age was killed by drought, earthquakes, migrations, Iron Age weapons spreading from peripheries, and the system's failure of interlinked palace economies, again working together. No single one of those factors would have produced either collapse on its own. All of them together produced both. The third is totality. Akkad's capital has never been found. Mycenaean literacy vanished for 400 years. Joseph Tainter's 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, developed the formal model. Eric Klein's 2014 book, 1177 BC, provided the modern synthesis for the late Bronze Age. The two books agree on a single core observation. Complexity is not free. Maintaining an empire, a palace economy, or a long-distance trade network costs energy and information at every node. When the inputs degrade, the whole network can unravel inside a single political career. The modern world looks more like 1990 BC than people prefer to admit. Interlocking supply chains, continent-spanning trade, centralized palace economies in the form of capital cities and corporate headquarters, a small number of pinch-point technologies on which everything else depends. The lesson of Akkad and the late Bronze Age is not that collapse is inevitable. The lesson is that it is possible, that it has happened before, and that when it happens, it tends to be much faster and much more complete than the people living through it expected. Across 13,000 years, from the cotton hunter-gatherers at Jebel Sahaba to the Egyptian river galleys at the Battle of the Delta, the pattern visible in this countdown is depressingly consistent. Humans built more, organized more, recorded more, and fought more. Every leap in civilizational scale produced a corresponding leap in the scale of organized violence. 12 dead in a Sudanese cemetery becomes 34, in a German pit becomes 4,000. In a German marsh becomes whole civilizations vanishing inside a generation. The corollary is just as consistent. Every civilization on this list left behind survivors, memory, technology, and political ideas. The late Bronze Age destroyed Mycenaean palaces, but did not erase Greek language or Greek place names. The fall of Akkad ended an empire, but propagated Akkadian as a diplomatic lingua franca for 1,500 more years. The Hittites looted Marduk, and a Kassite king later returned the statue to Babylon. Collapse can be total without being absolute. The forensic revolution since 2010 guarantees that more will be revised in the next decade. The next round of ancient DNA results from Tollense. The next micro-CT pass at Jebel Sahaba. The next satellite reconstruction of looted Hamoukar will change parts of the picture again. Some interpretations will be intensified. Others will be softened. The total picture, on every available indicator, will only become more granular, more dated, and more violent. The closing thought is the only one that matters. The countdown is finished, but the pattern is not. Every century since 1175 BC has produced its own version of the battles on this list. Every century since has had a Mursili, a Sea Peoples, a King of Kadesh, a Tollense crossing. Knowing the deep history of war is not the same as ending it. It is, however, the first step in not repeating it.